To overcome the issues we saw with testing our components that consume Redux in the last video, we're going to create a custom render method that we can use inside of our test. So first, we'll import configure store from the Redux toolkit, which allows us to abstract the create store and essentially set up the Redux store for our application. Next, we'll import the render method from the React testing library, but we'll import it as RTL render. And the reason we're doing this is because later we're going to create our own custom render method, but we need to maintain the real render method so that we can have access to all of its available API methods. Then we'll import faker, which will allow us to auto-generate test data that we can use to pass in as our initial state for our component under test. We'll import provider, which allows us to access methods that we can use to access and modify the state. And lastly, we'll import the retail reducer, which sets up the state and creates all of the methods that we can use to access and update the state. And then as test data that we can use, we'll create an object that houses all of the data for the different products that we can use in our test case. And so essentially, this object is in the shape of our Redux store, but we actually have something to start off with in our products. Now we'll create our custom render method. So the first parameter that our render method will accept is UI, which should be the component under test. The next parameter will be an object with a number of items. The first item is initial state. So this is the test data that we will pass into our component inside of our test case. This next piece will configure a store with the reducer, and preloaded state will take in the initial state, which is again the test data that we provide to a component inside of our test case. And then if there are any other options that we pass in, which we typically won't need to do for our testing purposes, then we'll accept those parameters. Then the next thing we'll do is create a wrapper function, which will accept the number of children, which for our purposes will be the component that we want to test inside of our test case. So this function will return a provider with the store, and it will wrap the children, which again will be our component that we want to test. And then lastly, we'll return the real instance of the render method from React testing library with our UI passed in, and for the wrapper option, the wrapper function that we created, along with any extra render options. And then finally, we'll export everything from the React testing library so that we still have access to all the API methods available from React testing library. And finally, we'll export an object with our custom render method that we created and our fake store test data that we can use inside of any test case. Keep in mind, there's still the option to create your own individual test data for each test case. Now that we've created our own custom render method, in the next video, we'll see how to use this inside of a test case.